Hi, everybody. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank Monica. I think this is a great idea for a symposium, but I also think this Future of series has been really great for the profession. I have a number of students and even people in my office that I find watching these things on YouTube all the time, so I think it's been a really great service, so thank you for that. I am very happy to be on this panel that kind of spans the divide between history and practice, or history and theory, or practice and theory, or whatever the case may be. I need to, as McLean did, offer a bit of full disclosure and say, in order for you to understand this and me to give a little personal history, that I am a recovering classical architect. I spent about half of my architectural career doing classical architecture. This is my project from when I was 22, my thesis project from the University of Notre Dame, which is a few hours south of here. When I graduated from Notre Dame, after having done 5 years of classical architecture there, I went on to work and find a job in the most progressive architectural office in New York that I could find, and ended up with a job at Robert A. Stern Architects. When I went there, my professor, just to give you an idea of where I was coming from, said, "Stern's office, why would you go work for that modernist?" So my role in this panel discussion isn't as a typical, probably not as a typical practitioner, but I hope that the relationship that I have with history and how I use it in my office is somehow illuminating to someone somewhere. I want to start with 3 quick observations from Giambattista Vico, who was the philosopher of history from Naples around the early 18th century. And while there's a lot in Vico that you could have a symposium on your own from, I think the things which are most fruitful when discussing practice are 3 of his ideas that he was largely writing against Descartes and Hobbes. And he wrote about how historic cycles repeat, but they never repeat in the same way, that when they repeat in a new way. So evolution is coincident with this secular repetition of history, which I think is fruitful in understanding architectural precedent. He also mentioned, or in his book, The New Science, talks about how history is an empathetic practice, or an empathetic practice, where, again, this is articulating a position against Hobbes, where Hobbes and Descartes had a more clinical view of history, that you take your contemporary viewpoint and judge something which happened in the past. Vico's position was that you take a position that adopts the state of mind of the people that you're studying. So that gives you a kind of a more living, a more used, a more softer way of addressing history and studying history. And it's interesting that people from Isaiah Berlin to Joseph Rickwert have advocated for Vico having a greater position within architectural theory. At one point in time, he was even called the architect's philosopher, but his usefulness in architecture theory never really popped up, never really ignited. And then with these 2 observations, he also says that, and this is very interesting for this conference, I think, that historians are capable of producing a more profound knowledge than scientists are, because the study of history is ultimately the study of man, and the empathy which we have with our fellow man gives us access to truths which are not evident in clinical observation as it was represented by Descartes. So what I want to talk about first is this cyclical notion of history. This is a student project from Le Proust, who in 1825 was a student at the École and studying buildings from antiquity. This is his reconstruction of the Temple of Hera I in Paestum from 550 BC, and he did kind of a radical reconstruction where he included a center-occupied row of columns, which in classicism is basically hearsay, basically turns this into a market complex. Now this idea, this kind of radical absorption and rereading and manipulation of history is something that he used later in life when he was commissioned to do the Bibliothèque Sainte-Geneviève in Paris in 1825. If you see this interior cella of the Temple of Hera I and a center-occupied row of columns, 30 years later when he did the layout of the Sainte-Geneviève, you see the exact same cella with the center row occupied of columns. But what he did that was he fused that with a new logic of tectonics, a new logic of materials, a new logic of wrought iron, which allowed for these two volumes, which previously and historically would have seemed very separate by virtue of the thickness of the columns. He was able to create this light, diaphanous space. Now, if we fast forward until about 2 years ago, Greg Lynn was at the Future of History Symposium here, and he made a case for composite forms. So his example is a bunch of spheres that are kind of globbed together, and you can recognize the body of each individual sphere, but you can simultaneously recognize the whole body of the composition of all of the spheres. So there's a flickering reading between the individual part as a whole and the whole as a whole. This space has that same composite logic, that you can recognize this as an individual space, this is an individual space, but by virtue of the technology of the time, you also get the flickering read of the whole thing of the space. So this project not only projects back to the Temple of Hera 1, but projects forward and somehow resonates with some of the ideas about contemporaneity today. And I think it's a great example of how history, it's a simple example, but it's an example about how history can be used in a way that isn't necessarily a stylistic trope, as architects are more used to using it. And this is John McMurrow territory. It's a Kengo Kuma project, which I've always thought kind of funny, but if Vico is advocating for a more operative idea about history, and I say that with an architectural adaptation of an idea about operative history, then this, for me, is what would be a non-operative use of history. It's the operative qualities of the things being reproduced from history are divorced from what they historically operated as. So the column isn't functioning as a column, the arch isn't functioning as an arch, none of them are tectonic. And because it's divorced from any of its original operative qualities, it's seen as ironic, and that irony is seen as funny. So there's an operative use of history, and then a non-operative use of history, in this case, which I think is kind of superficially stylistic for its own set of reasons. That isn't a value judgment on this. This lineage of thought is alive today in the work of Fatt. This is their monument from a few years ago. But I think the real kind of battle today, which is too strong of a term, it says in the introduction here that younger architects are moving farther and farther away from using history as a justification of their work. And I blame that largely on omega-3 fatty acids. This is an image of omega-3 fatty acids, and I'm referring here, again, in our own little University of Michigan history here, to a comment that Sarah Whiting made at the Future of Design conference in 2009. Sarah was talking about how she had seen or heard of a studio that was using the processing of omega-3 fatty acids as justification for certain architectural moves, as if the research, and I use this term in quotes, of omega-3 fatty acids actually had something significant and critical to offer to architectural design. I think we're falling into a trap now where we're content to use what I'm calling, for the sake of this talk, amateur online research as a justification for our work, as opposed to a more, let's say, critical use of history, or even a more critical or analytical use of research. My position here in this talk is that if we're going to use research, it should be subject to all the requirements of research in other disciplines, which also rely on research. She mentioned in her talk specifically that she was baffled, this is her quote, baffled at the lack of interest, lack of research, lack of depth with our own architectural history or material within our own discipline. It's as if that doesn't carry enough weight for projects, and so the projects always have to turn to something else. So I also have observed this, I just like this image because it's as if the research got big enough that a woman could actually walk into it. I had written a piece in Log a couple of years ago in 2009 called In Defense of Design. I'm just going to read a brief excerpt of it. I know it's rather solipsistic to quote yourself in a talk, but I'm going for it. And it's a little snarky. I was in a very bad mood when I wrote this, but I think it gets the point across. We've all seen it on the walls of office conference rooms and studio pits. It's the big poster that used to have plans, sections, and elevations on it, but now boils them down to postage stamp-sized graphics to make room for all the important stuff. the program analysis charts that analyze how people move from book stacks to cafes over a 24-hour period, the careful examination of the flight paths of birds or of sunlight or voter registration regions. In fact, a project today could be wholly justified by an analysis of birds flying in the sunlight from cafes to voting polls over a 24-hour period. The diagrams would be great. Whether it is the fault of a past or contemporary fuzzy relationship between architectural theory and architectural design, or just a general cynical malaise in the face of the discipline's loss of consensus, we are left with an unquestioned amateur research architecture narrative in contemporary architectural design. This new narrative, by virtue of its ease and openness to interpretation, its quick accessibility by even the most tender-footed of students, eclipses the more historic use of architectural precedent as a methodology through which design is taught. The former demands information, while the latter demands knowledge and a dedicated understanding of the historic lineage of architecture, hard things to come by with a quick Google search. While the mapping of research is justified by assuming a legitimate cause and effect relationship with cursorily observed problems, whether contextual, environmental, or programmatic, and their subsequent architectural solutions, the alternative of a precedent-based approach is based on the assumption that architecture is not only merely a solution to pressing contemporary problems, but a living trajectory of invention added to by each successive generation. Knowledge of precedent is difficult to obtain. It requires more than the graphic reorganization of recently downloaded data, instead demanding study of complex spatial ideas throughout history. So if the weapons of research architecture, as practice, are seemingly rational solutions to observed contextual, environmental, or programmatic problems, then those of precedent are a deep involvement with a historic legacy and a knowledge and intuition, in the Bergsonian sense, to recognize one's architectural contribution to a historic lineage of architectural efforts. Now, I'm not against architectural research. I'm against an amateur use of the term research, which might better be called inspiration. I actually love research. We do research in my office. It's critical to all aspects of architecture. But I think in the form in which we assume that it's active today, it's insufficient for source material for architecture as we're currently seem to be using it. Basically, I feel that architecture community's tolerance for amateur online research used to support design is somewhat akin to this cartoon, which I ran across a couple of months ago. This is the part where I tell you how great my office is because we rely on history. And I should say that I'm going to point out a couple of examples on how we use historic ideas in my office, but I want to make very clear that these aren't the only sources of inspiration in my office. We do research, but I find history and the use of history and this Vico sense of history incredibly fruitful in dealing with some of the problems and dealing with some of the problems of innovation that I'm coming across today. So in the last 2 minutes of this is rather intimidating as it kind of kicks up here in front of me, like I'm going to be doused in goop or something when it hits 15 minutes. Three ideas. I'm going to cover one idea by Serlio called the Carpo Transperiente, another idea which is about how classicism is the articulation of parts as opposed to a logic of smoothness, and the last is a renewed interest in rustication. So to be brief, the Carpo Transperiente, Serlio was a 16th century architect and theorist who wrote a rather influential book and included this idea about the Carpo Transperiente, which is a transparent box that was used for Serlio, later adopted by Henri Blondel in his Corps d'Architecture, that allows the architect to reconcile highly figural geometries. In this example, you have Bernini's Baldacchina, which is a highly figural architectural geometry, with this Carpo, which is a Euclidean geometry that basically allows you to apply a system of proportions to something which is inherently resistant to a system of Euclidean proportions. So it's a way of negotiating the world between Euclidean geometries and Platonic solids, and a newer, contemporary, more plastic language of form, which was emerging in the 17th century. We use that same concept of this bounding box to try to tame these surface geometries which are emerging in various scripting capacities and in various surface modeling programs, as a way to reconcile the figural ambitions of these projects, which almost always end up in too many sloped floors and too many ramps and too many walkways. And we're trying to produce things which snap this figural technology back into more traditional architectural constraints. So you can see this is a I won't talk about the project, just about the aspect of this historic idea which we're using. We're using it in the panelized system. This is a prototype of a panel. We're using it in the courtyard of the system, where the mass of the courtyard is determined by a simple platonic solid, but the figure of the surface is allowed to exhibit some of the more robust surface modeling qualities that are available today. So it's trying to create a resonance between these two geometric systems. One's historic, one being, as I see, more contemporary. I'm not the only person doing this. I think other practitioners using these technologies are. Greg Lynn certainly is, by shaving off the ends of some of his things to produce these figures. The last two things I want to talk about very quickly. One is classicism as a language of parts. My generation is very interested in smoothness, and I think the whole idea of taking a floor, shifting it into a wall, and shifting it into a ceiling is probably the worst idea in architecture. I instead am very interested in the way, in a classical base, a vertical surface is negotiated with the horizontal surface through a surface language of compression, where the torus, scotia, and torus create the visual effect as if the vertical column is transferring its weight to the horizontal plate. That's done with a surface language. In modernism, with, say, Mies at the Barcelona Pavilion, there's a tacit agreement between the vertical and the horizontal, and it just says that it's making a nod to the fact that they're related by using a tactic of alignment. So one is a surface modeling strategy in section, one is a planar alignment strategy. So in our office, we're using some base floor connections which take advantage of both, the use of the seam, the use of alignment, and the use of a surface application that implies a transition of forces. We're also using these articulation strategies in some solar flowers we're doing that showcase this solar material, solar technology with inside. We're using profiles on surface modeling and changes in material like Mies, once again fusing these two interests to form what's basically a new language of cornices for surface modeling that we're using to generate different types of reflection. Using it for a different reason than you would classically, but working against the inherent desire for these software packages to want to smooth everything out, and looking again at articulation as a desirable thing in architecture. This is our, I'll skip this, but it's just talking about the kind of primitive nature of trying to find a new language. We're doing this at larger scales in a residential tower in downtown Manhattan, where we're trying to get a phenomenal reading of what happens beyond the surface of the space through making very subtle changes in the surface. So we're still working within a language of continuity, but trying to generate difference within that language. This just shows some of the units and plans. And the last kind of site of inquiry where I get mileage is in a renewed interest in rustication. So in the past, rustication was something that was easier to do. It was hard to get something smooth. Now it's very easy to get something smooth, both in the computer and in the way we purchase things for architecture. It's very difficult to get to something rusticated. So we're looking at rustication as a way to amp up our interest in articulation, but using a new language. So some of the new languages we're looking at are FAT, not the architecture firm. This has using some qualities of subsurface scattering, which is kind of a new material quality, which I think is a very contemporary thing, but we're using fatness to get thin areas and fat areas because the light scatters differently. It doesn't show up very well on this slide, but you basically get glow and shadows that are cast within inside a surface. We're also looking at micro-scale sectional moves that, when cobbled together, form macro-scale figural gestures. And these are some studies that we're doing with scripting these components together. We're making these bricks, which are all identical, but are Boolean together in certain ways. These are some of the tests in our office where you make an army of these bricks, and they stack together and they stack up trying again to generate a new logic of rustication that further accentuates this idea of part-to-whole relationships and, in a sense, harks back to an architecture of pieces and parts. And for that, we're, invested in the historic content and invested in trying to retrieve some of that resonance between parts and wholes, and to do that, we're using history. So look forward to hearing the rest of your talks. Thanks for your time.